Hey guys, tonight we step into the heavy summer air of a Mughal garden, where the paths are warm even after sunset, the brick channels still breathe out stored heat, and pale green melons lie under broad leaves like guarded little moons. You can almost feel the dust clinging to your ankles, hear water slipping through carved runnels, and smell that strange royal mixture of wet earth, crushed mint, and ambition. Because this is not just gardening. This is courtly pressure with a hoe. Somewhere beyond the cypress shade, someone with embroidered sleeves expects fruit so cool, sweet, and elegant that it seems to have personally offended the sun. And you, poor soul, are close enough to the work to learn a useful historical lesson. You probably won't survive this without sweat in places you did not know could sweat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, post your location and local time down below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in North India during the Mughal age, when emperors commissioned gardens not merely as pleasant green spaces, but as statements about order, paradise, power, and taste. The Mughals, descended from Central Asian and Timurid traditions, are famous for formal gardens laid out in geometric plans, often with watercourses, terraces, and fruit trees carefully arranged to suggest harmony in a world that is otherwise mostly dust, weather, and tax paperwork. The mainstream historical fact here is simple enough: Mughal elites truly loved gardens, and emperors like Babur and Jahangir wrote about them with real feeling, noticing flowers, fruits, breezes, and the relief of running water. They are conquerors, yes, but also men capable of becoming very emotional over a well-placed stream. And in this elegant setting, melons matter. Not in the casual modern way where you toss one into a supermarket cart because it looked less bruised than the others. No, these melons carry prestige. Their sweetness suggests refinement. Their cool flesh offers relief in punishing weather. Their successful cultivation demonstrates skill over climate itself, which is a very Mughal kind of flex. A ruler can build walls, raise armies, and sponsor poets, but if his gardeners can present delicate, well-ripened melons in the hottest months, then civilization is clearly winning. You move farther into the grounds and discover that the garden is not one smooth carpet of luxury. It is a working place. Beds are raised. Paths are tamped hard. Water channels divide the plots with a tidy confidence that suggests geometry has been promoted to religion. Men bend low over the earth before the day has even fully bloomed. A supervisor watches. Somewhere a boy carries a basket. Somewhere else another mutters at a stubborn patch of soil in the timeless language of agriculture, which is mostly complaint with brief poetic intervals. The melon vines themselves are not yet the glorious prize you imagine from a painted court scene. They are vulnerable, sprawling things, dependent on timing, moisture, spacing, and a level of patience that would break most people raised on same-day delivery. A melon cannot be bullied into sweetness. It can only be coaxed. That word matters. Coax suggests persuasion, not force. You do not command a melon through summer heat. You flatter it. You shield it. You feed it just enough. You watch it like a court intrigue with leaves. Historians still argue whether the most prized melon-growing methods in Mughal India came primarily through Central Asian horticultural inheritance, or whether local Indian knowledge shaped the practice just as deeply from the beginning. The truth is likely a braided one, because empires are rarely pure in their habits. They borrow, adapt, boast, and then pretend they invented everything. The Mughal court famously treasured fruits associated with their Central Asian homeland, especially melons and grapes, and there are long traditions of rulers trying to recreate remembered tastes in new climates. But India is not Central Asia. It is hotter, wetter in some seasons, more extreme in others, and much less interested in your nostalgic fantasies. So any gardener trying to grow melons here must negotiate between inherited desire and local reality. That negotiation begins with heat. Summer in the Indo-Gangetic plains can feel less like weather and more like a verdict. The ground hardens. Water vanishes with alarming speed. Wind arrives hot, as if someone has opened an oven for the entire horizon. You quickly understand why the successful gardener is half artist, half engineer, and half exhausted magician. Yes, that is three halves. Sleepy history allows this. Mughal summer does not care about your arithmetic. Yet the very challenge creates the glamour. Plenty of plants can simply exist. Melons must be made comfortable enough to become luxurious. Their roots need moisture without rot. Their leaves need sun but not too much. Their fruits need time to swell without scorching. Even their placement can be strategic, set where the soil holds coolness a little longer or where shade can be provided at key moments. The garden is not static. It is a sequence of small interventions, each one easy to miss if you are only admiring the fountains and pretending empire is mostly silk cushions. There is also the human hierarchy wrapped around this fruit. At the top are the patrons, emperors, princes, governors, grandees, and noble households with refined appetites and no personal intention of hauling water at dawn. Below them are overseers, estate managers, record keepers, and skilled horticultural hands who understand not only planting but timing, soils, irrigation, and presentation. Below them again are the laborers whose backs absorb the actual truth of paradise. Someone always has to make this symmetry happen. Someone always has to clear the channel when a clump of mud decides to become a political problem. A quirky tidbit drifts into your mind as you walk. Some early modern gardeners and plant enthusiasts across the Persianate world occasionally treated especially fine melons almost like personalities, praising their lineage, flavor, and place of origin with a seriousness usually reserved for horses, poets, or very dramatic nephews. It is one of history's quieter delights that human beings can become aristocratic about produce. Somewhere in the broader world, wars are fought and treaties collapse, and here a man is thoughtfully comparing melons as if judging philosophers. You pass a shaded corner where tools rest against a wall and catch sight of the materials that will quietly run this whole story: baskets, hose, rope, reeds, earthen vessels, and hands. Always hands. The Mughal garden is admired for design, but design alone does not cool a root bed. It does not notice wilting at noon. It does not shift water before sunrise or spread mulch before the topsoil cracks. Real cultivation lives in repetition. You begin to sense that the glory of the melon will rest not in one grand flourish, but in hundreds of ordinary acts performed well and on time. And that, more than anything, is the mood settling over the path as evening thickens. The garden seems luxurious from a distance, but up close it is a place of careful bargains with sun, water, soil, and expectation. The melons are still out there under the leaves, not yet sliced, not yet praised, not yet sent in baskets toward a noble table. For now they are only promises. Green, warm, vulnerable promises. You walk beside them while the last light slides over the channels, and already the next question begins to rise with the night air. If summer is this relentless, how do the gardeners keep enough water moving through this place before the heat steals it all? By the time the sky is only beginning to pale, you are already awake, which feels unfair. But then fairness has never been a major agricultural principle. The air at this hour is briefly kind. Not cool, exactly, but lenient. The brick paths have given up some of yesterday's stored anger. The leaves hold a trace of night moisture, and the first workers move with a quiet purpose that tells you this part of the day matters more than almost any other. If the melons are going to survive what is coming, the work begins now, before the sun climbs high enough to turn every drop of water into memory. You follow the gardeners toward the water system, and suddenly the pretty channels you admired at dusk reveal their less decorative personality. The Mughal garden is famous for its flowing water, and rightly so. Across imperial landscapes, watercourses, tanks, cascades, and fountains are among the most recognizable features of Mughal design, influenced by Persian and Timurid garden traditions and adapted to South Asian settings. But here, in the practical half-light, water is not just aesthetic philosophy. It is scheduling. It is pressure. It is argument. It is one man insisting that a bed was watered yesterday, and another man replying, with dignified irritation, that the soil disagrees. A mainstream historical fact slips neatly into place. Mughal gardens often depended on sophisticated hydraulic systems, including wells, channels, lifted water, and gravity-fed distribution where terrain allowed. In some regions and on some estates, water was drawn using devices such as the Persian wheel, known in South Asia for lifting water from wells or rivers by means of a wheel turned by animal power, often oxen. You can imagine the creak of wood, the slow circular patience of the mechanism, and the endless chain of pots rising dripping from the dark. It is the kind of technology that looks simple until you realize entire landscapes are leaning on it. You hear it before you see it fully, the groaning axle, the splash of pots emptying, the low shuffle of animals beginning their day with all the enthusiasm of junior office staff. The wheel turns. Water rises. Men guide it onward into masonry channels or temporary earthen runs scratched toward waiting plots. Nothing here can be casual. Too much water and a melon root may sulk, yellow, or rot. Too little and the vines will flatten into dusty disappointment. The gardeners are not simply watering. They are rationing comfort. Historians still argue whether formal Mughal garden hydraulics were more symbolically important than agriculturally productive in certain elite spaces, especially where ornamental design competed with practical cultivation. But on the ground, in places where fruits were expected, those distinctions blur. A channel can be beautiful and useful at once. An emperor may admire reflections while a gardener measures whether enough moisture reached the bed before sunrise. Paradise and irrigation, it turns out, can share infrastructure. You crouch near one of the melon beds and see the logic of timing. The water is sent early so that the soil can drink before the full heat arrives. Surface moisture that lingers into blazing daylight may vanish fast, but water that seeps down into the root zone stands a better chance. The gardeners seem to know their earth by touch. One presses a handful between finger and thumb, examining texture with the grave expression of a jeweler appraising a gem. Another scrapes aside the top layer to check how far the damp has traveled. You realize this is one of those historical skills that sounds simple until you try it yourself and accidentally irrigate either nothing or everything. In some plots the channels are permanent, brick-lined and tidy, reflecting the ordered geometry of the garden. In others, especially nearer productive beds, little ridges and furrows direct the flow in humble ways that would never make it into a court painting. This is the part imperial miniatures politely leave out. The mud on the ankles, the brief panic when a channel wall gives way, the deeply unromantic sight of a worker plugging a leak with his heel. The empire loves symmetry. Water loves gossip and wandering off. There is a rhythm to the labor. Lift, guide, release, check, redirect. Earthen buns hold the flow long enough for each basin or bed to take its share. Small openings are blocked and reopened with a trowel or a practiced foot. Sometimes water is allowed to circle around a mound rather than drown the center. Sometimes a channel is slowed by straw, clods, or woven bits of brush so the flow does not rush past too quickly. Everything depends on speed and patience at once. It is a contradiction, which is really just gardening wearing a turban. A quirky tidbit survives in old horticultural lore from across South and Central Asia. Some growers believed the taste of melons could subtly reflect not just water quantity but water character, whether it came from a sweet well, a silty river source, or a cooler upland channel. Modern science would word this more carefully, but the intuition is not entirely silly. Mineral content, soil conditions, and irrigation habits do shape flavor. Still, you have to admire the confidence of anyone taking a bite and declaring, like a fruit sommelier, that this melon clearly had provincial water and perhaps an inattentive uncle. The laborers move quickly because the window is short. Dawn is not leisurely here. You can feel the light sharpening by degrees. Birds begin. Servants appear carrying tools, coiled rope, perhaps an earthen jar. Someone checks the level in a cistern. Someone else inspects a sluice. In larger garden complexes, water management may involve layers of responsibility, from estate officials to skilled workers familiar with the flow patterns of particular plots. This is not a one-man art but a coordinated habit. Even the melon beds, low and humble among the grander trees and pavilions, are folded into the same larger choreography. And of course there is inequality in every drop. A courtly garden with access to labor and infrastructure can protect delicate crops in ways a poorer cultivator cannot. You become aware that these melons survive not only because of horticultural wisdom, but because an empire can command bodies, beasts, masonry, and time. A peasant field in a harsher district may rely on monsoon luck and family effort. Here, melon sweetness is backed by administration. It is very luxurious to be a fruit with a budget. As the watering continues, the ground changes under your feet. Patches of dry dust darken. The smell of wet earth rises, deep, mineral, almost sweet, and briefly the whole garden feels less scorched, less defensive. The leaves seem to lift. Vines that looked weary in yesterday's heat now appear quietly determined, as if they too know the routine. Drink now. Endure later. It is a strategy with ancient dignity and modern relevance, though your own version may involve iced coffee and avoidance. You watch one gardener pause by a melon hill, making a slight depression and then smoothing it again, so the next watering will hold where needed rather than flee down the slope. Another clears weeds that might steal moisture. Another shades a tiny seedling with a casual gesture so practiced it nearly disappears. Water alone is never enough. Water must be paired with judgment. Soon the first real shafts of sun are cutting over the walls and through the trees. The hour of generosity is ending. The workers finish the last channels, close what must be closed, and leave the soil to guard its hidden dampness through the long furnace ahead. You straighten up, already warm, already a little sticky, and understand something the melons teach without speaking. Survival in summer is decided before noon. By the time the heat becomes obvious, the important choices have already been made. And with the water settled into the earth, your eyes drift to the beds themselves, to the shape of the ground, to how carefully the soil has been heaped and folded, because the next secret lies not in what is poured onto the garden, but in how the earth is prepared to keep it. The water has sunk from sight, but not from importance, and now your attention drops to the ground itself, to the melon beds that at first look like simple mounds and now begin to seem like the true cleverness of the whole operation. In the growing light, the gardeners move along the plots with hoes, baskets, and that steady expression of people who know the soil has moods. You step carefully between raised ridges, trying not to crush anything valuable or embarrass yourself in front of several centuries of agricultural competence. It is immediately obvious that melon growing here is not just about planting seeds and hoping the universe feels generous. The earth has been shaped, coaxed, and arranged with the same seriousness a court tailor might give a robe. The mainstream historical fact is straightforward. Pre-modern gardeners across South Asia, including in Mughal domains, often relied on finely tuned local knowledge of soils, raised beds, basins, and seasonal moisture management to grow delicate or high-value crops. This is not glamorous on paper, which is why emperors get portraits and soil structure gets ignored, but your melon is much more likely to owe its existence to the person who understood texture, drainage, and heat retention than to the noble who later complements the flavor with poetic eyebrows. You kneel beside one bed and see how the surface is not flat at all. A slight mound runs along the center, with shallow channels at the sides. Some planting spots rise a little higher, others are ringed so water can collect without drowning the stem. The logic becomes clearer the longer you look. Raised soil helps roots avoid stagnation after watering, especially if a sudden summer storm appears with all the emotional balance of an offended king. Yet the bed is not so high that moisture drains away instantly. This is a garden balancing between opposite dangers: too wet, too dry, too hot, too exposed. The shape of the earth becomes an argument against extremes. A gardener breaks a clod in his palm and you notice the soil is friable, loosened, not packed like roadside dust. Melons like their roots to travel. Hard earth is a prison sentence in slow motion. So the beds must be worked and reworked, turned and broken, perhaps mixed with sandier material where the clay holds too much, perhaps enriched with organic matter where the ground is thin or tired. In the Mughal world, gardeners had access to a wide range of manures and amendments. Animal dung, ash, decayed vegetation, and other local materials were not glamorous, but they were essential. History, as usual, is partly a story of empires and partly a story of things that rot helpfully. You catch the smell of dung worked into older beds, softened by sun and time into something less offensive than expected, though still not exactly a luxury perfume. There is a quiet joke in that. A court may praise the final melon for its cool sweetness, but few diners pause to toast the decomposed animal contributions that made it possible. Agriculture is full of relationships nobody wants acknowledged at dinner. Historians still argue whether elite Mughal horticulture systematically codified soil preparation methods across the empire or whether most melon-growing practice remained highly local, transmitted by custom rather than centralized manuals. There were certainly Persianate traditions of garden writing and agricultural knowledge circulating in the wider world, and courts loved classification when it suited them. But in practice, soil wisdom often lives in the hands, not in the archive. A gardener presses earth, smells it, watches how it cakes after watering, notices how long a patch stays damp after dawn. That sort of knowledge rarely arrives in official prose with proper credit. You walk along another row and spot a layer of fine organic litter scattered between plants. Not thick enough to smother, just enough to shade the soil and slow evaporation. Mulch, in essence, though nobody here is making a cheerful modern gardening video about it. This could be chopped straw, dried leaves, reeds, or sweepings judged useful rather than pretty. In summer, this thin protective layer matters. Bare soil bakes. Covered soil keeps its secrets longer. The trick, of course, is moderation. Too much damp material can invite rot or insects. Too little and the sun comes in like an auditor, finding every weakness. There is also the art of orientation. Beds may be aligned to take advantage of prevailing breeze, available water flow, and the path of the sun over walls, trees, or built structures. In a formal garden, utility has to negotiate with geometry, which must be irritating if you are the one responsible for both beauty and melons. Somewhere, some PERS supervisor has certainly had to explain that while perfect symmetry is admirable, the plants would prefer not to die for it. A quirky tidbit lingers from broader early modern horticultural culture. Growers in several regions sometimes talked about warm and cool soils almost as if the ground had temperament, associating darker, richer, or more sheltered earth with gentler conditions for roots. This language overlaps a little with humoral thinking and a little with practical observation. You can smile at the poetry of it, but when you kneel here and feel how one patch stays moist and another turns hot and crusty by mid-morning, the old vocabulary stops seeming foolish. Soil does have a personality. Some of it is generous. Some of it would absolutely let you down in public. One worker uses a hoe to pull loose earth around the base of a vine, not burying it deeply, just refreshing the little hill that supports the plant. Another crumbles the surface after watering to break a forming crust. This is one of those quiet agricultural moves that would bore a careless observer senseless, and save a crop at the same time. A hard crust can repel later watering, trap air poorly, and expose roots to harsher swings in temperature. So the gardener breaks it gently, like smoothing the sheet of a child who has kicked in their sleep. Imperial ASMR, but with more dust. The melon itself remains modest for now. A small swelling behind a flower. A green globe the size of a fist. A fruit still hidden under leaves, its future depending on whether the bed beneath it can remain cool enough through the afternoon. You begin to understand why the gardeners fuss over earth like jewelers over velvet. The soil is not background. It is the fruit's mattress, pantry, and weather shield all at once. And because this is the Mughal world, there is also the matter of transportability and prestige. Fine melons may be grown in specially tended plots close to water, near residences, or in zones where labor can be concentrated. Soil preparation in these favored areas may receive attention ordinary staple crops never see. That imbalance is telling. Wheat feeds people. Melons impress them. States need both, but courts write better poems about one of them. As the morning ripens toward heat, the beds reveal their cleverness more clearly. Their shapes slow runoff, shelter roots, and hold dampness below the surface where the sun cannot immediately steal it. Their loosened texture invites roots spread. Their mixed materials help manage drainage and fertility. Their mulch skins by precious hours against evaporation. This is what survival looks like before it becomes sweetness. You brush dust from your hands and stand, noticing how even the warm breeze feels harsher now. The gardeners continue without fuss, adjusting mounds, clearing tiny weeds, checking how the soil gives under pressure. Every melon here is rooted in choices made days and weeks earlier. And soon those choices narrow further, because not every seed deserves this effort. Somewhere nearby are the small packets, jars, or folded cloths that hold the beginning of the next crop, and with them another kind of judgment entirely. Which seeds are worth trusting, which melons are worth repeating, and how a gardener chooses future sweetness before a vine has even touched the earth. The beds are ready, the moisture is hidden below the surface like a guarded secret. And now everything turns on something much smaller than imperial architecture or hydraulic cleverness. Seeds. Tiny, flat, easy to lose, easy to dismiss, and somehow carrying the entire burden of taste, texture, timing, and reputation. You walk toward a shaded work area where the morning light is still gentle, and there, in folded cloth packets, small bowls, and the corners of practiced hands, lies the next season in miniature. It is oddly humbling. Whole courts may dream of chilled slices on hot afternoons, but first someone has to choose the right little pale seed and hope the future agrees. The mainstream historical fact here is that Mughal horticulture, like so much early modern cultivation, depended on active exchange of prized plant varieties across regions. The Mughal elite inherited and encouraged broad networks of movement, of people, texts, tools, and crops, linking Central Asia, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent. Fruits in particular carried prestige. Certain melons were admired not only for flavor but for their place of origin, which meant seeds and cuttings traveled through imperial channels, merchant routes, gift networks, and the quieter routes of gardeners talking to other gardeners when officials were not trying to look important. Empires may issue orders, but seeds often travel by gossip, You watch one senior gardener empty a cloth packet into his palm. He studies the seeds with such concentration that for a moment you think he is reading poetry. He is not. He is doing something even more serious, deciding which ones look full, sound, and likely. The thin or damaged are set aside. The plump ones remain. It is not a dramatic act, but it has enormous consequences. A weak seed means poor germination, an uneven stand of plants, wasted water, wasted labor, wasted summer. And a wasted summer in a Mughal garden is the kind of thing that can travel upward through the hierarchy with unnerving speed. Selection begins long before this morning, of course. The seeds come from previous fruits judged worthy of repeating. That means gardeners are not only growing melons, they are also quietly editing the future. They may prefer sweetness, fragrance, storage quality, shape, rind thickness, resistance to splitting, or timing in relation to the hot season. In a palace context, appearance matters too. A fruit should be pleasing before it is even cut. History is full of societies pretending beauty and practicality are separate. Gardeners know better. Historians still argue whether the most celebrated melon varieties cultivated under the Mughals remain genetically distinct imports from Central Asia for long, or whether they rapidly hybridized and adapted into regional Indian forms under local conditions. It is a deliciously nerdy debate, and exactly the sort of thing that keeps scholars happily indoors while someone else weeds. The answer is probably messy, because seeds do what they always do when people exchange them across climates and generations. They adapt, drift, surprise, and occasionally disappoint in ways that produce excellent arguments centuries later. There is also trust involved. Not every seed seller deserves your admiration. In any large urban economy there are middlemen, merchants, and optimists, and these groups overlap more than anyone likes to admit. A gardener may prefer seeds saved from known stock or exchanged through reliable circles. Good lineages matter. Proven fruits matter. Taste memories matter. One can almost imagine a discreet pre-modern version of product reviews. Lovely aroma, poor vigor, absolutely collapsed in dry wind, would not purchase again. A quirky tidbit from early horticultural traditions across Asia and the Islamic world is that growers sometimes assigned varieties names so evocative they sounded half agricultural, half poetic, names tied to regions, colors, sweetness, or physical charm. While not every Mughal melon name is recoverable with certainty, the culture of naming prize fruits was real, and it tells you something important. People did not regard melons as generic units. They distinguished them, ranked them, remembered them, and no doubt argued about them with the sleepy intensity now reserved for coffee beans and obscure tomatoes. You see some seeds soaked briefly before planting, perhaps to encourage faster germination, perhaps simply as part of a local routine passed from mentor to apprentice. Others are dusted with ash or mixed with fine dry earth for easier handling. Whether every such trick has measurable effect is another matter. Agricultural practice often includes a sensible core wrapped in ritual, habit, and inherited confidence. Modern gardeners are no different, just louder online. The planting itself is careful. Seeds are placed in prepared hills or pockets rather than flung broadly. Spacing matters. Too close, and the vines compete for moisture in a season already stingy with it. Too far apart, and precious watered ground is wasted. Some hills receive several seeds, insurance against failure, later thinned to favor the strongest seedlings. It is practical and faintly ruthless. Every garden contains a small monarchy of chosen survivors. Nearby, an older worker tells a younger one to mark the rows properly, and you get the sense that memory alone is not always enough. In larger productive gardens, especially where multiple varieties or staggered sowings are involved, some method of keeping track would be essential, even if informal. Perhaps it is done by position, by custom, by the knowledge of a trusted overseer who would rather die than let the sweet oval kind get mixed up with the later green striped one. Bureaucracy, like mildew, can appear wherever conditions allow. The seed question is bound up with prestige too. Courtly tastes can make a variety fashionable. If an emperor praises a certain fruit, if a prince requests melons from a famous district, if travelers flatter one region's produce over another, suddenly there is pressure to replicate that flavor under less cooperative skies. This is where ambition enters the seed bowl. Gardeners are not merely preserving what grows well. Sometimes they are chasing remembered excellence from another climate, another childhood, another imperial nostalgia. It is one thing to want a Central Asian melon in theory. It is another to persuade one to behave in North Indian summer. You glance at the planted hills and think about the uncertainty hidden under each one. Germination is a kind of faith, though gardeners would probably roll their eyes at that and call it work. Still, there is suspense. Will the seedlings emerge evenly? Will the heat come too fast? Will a dry wind catch them before their roots settle? This is the part no court poet can guarantee with elegant metaphors. And then there are the more eccentric beliefs. Some growers in various traditions preferred seeds from fruits that ripened under particular conditions, or from especially early or especially handsome melons, believing such traits would carry with unusual fidelity. Sometimes they were right in broad terms. Sometimes they were indulging what all humans indulge, the hope that excellence can be inherited neatly. If only dynasties had worked that well. By now the sun is fully up, and the planted mounds look unchanged, which is the insulting thing about seed work. Great care goes in, and the earth responds by looking almost exactly as it did before. No applause. No trumpet. Just a bed of prepared soil and a faint sense of expectation. Yet that expectation has a weight to it. The future sweetness of the garden now lies below, in chosen kernels that carry memory, trade, adaptation, and taste. You brush your hands clean and move on, because seeds alone will not survive the months ahead. Soon the first seedlings will rise delicate into the light, and when they do, another challenge appears immediately over them like a second sun: how to protect tender growth from the savage brightness above without smothering it under too much care. The seedlings arrive so modestly that it seems almost rude of the sun to notice them. One day the prepared hills are only earth and promise, and then suddenly there they are, small green mouths opening above the soil, two first leaves, then another, each one soft enough to look like it might apologize for existing. You lean closer, and the whole enterprise feels absurdly fragile. After all that careful seed selection, all that dawn watering and folded soil, the future of imperial melon prestige now resembles something a distracted sandal could end forever. It is at this stage that the gardeners become less like field workers and more like stagehands managing a very delicate performance. The heat is already sharpening again, and your path leads toward the quieter ingenuity of shade. Not the grand shade of china trees or pavilion roofs, though those matter in the larger composition of the garden. This is humbler, more portable, and far more intimate. Reed screens. Leafy cuttings stuck into the ground at angles. Woven mats propped low against the afternoon glare. Bits of branch and brush positioned so that a seedling receives light but not punishment. It is the old agricultural trick of giving a plant just enough protection to believe the world is tolerable. A mainstream historical fact sits comfortably here. Early modern South Asian cultivation often made practical use of locally available materials: reeds, straw, thatch, branches, woven fiber, to shield young plants, moderate moisture loss, and manage microclimates. None of this requires a royal decree. It requires observation and a reluctance to let expensive fruit become compost. In Mughal gardens, where refinement and productivity overlap, such ordinary materials could play an outsized role. History loves marble. But most crops are actually saved by things that look like a broom exploded thoughtfully nearby. You watch a pair of workers set up a row of light reed panels on the western side of a bed, the side that will take the harsher afternoon blast. The angle is subtle. Too upright, and the wind catches it. Too low, and the airflow dies. Too close, and the young vines grow weak and damp. Too far, and the sun still pours in with its usual tyranny. The effect is not permanent shade, only relief at the worst hours. That is often all a plant needs, not comfort, just less insult. Another bed is protected with cut branches whose leaves have not yet dried out. Their shade is speckled and temporary, which may be exactly the point. A seedling does not need lifelong coddling. It needs a few strategic days of mercy while its roots deepen into the coolness prepared for them below. Once established, the vine can take more light, more heat, more wind. But at the beginning it is a tiny aristocrat with impossible standards. Frankly, it would fit right in at court. Historians still argue whether Mughal horticultural practice in elite gardens systematically used artificial shade for delicate summer crops or whether such methods were more common in kitchen gardens, market plots, and vernacular cultivation beyond the spaces most often described by chroniclers. That uncertainty makes sense. The improvised tricks of gardeners rarely receive the same literary devotion as fountains and terraces. A visiting poet may praise flowing water and cypress avenues, yet fail to mention the reed hurdle quietly saving the melons from becoming warm regrets. Still, the physical evidence of common sense is all around you. Shade is not abstract here. It is set, shifted, repaired, and argued over. One worker nudges a screen a little farther east. Another mutters that yesterday's breeze came from the other direction. A supervisor squints at the angle of sunlight with the severity of a military planner. Somewhere behind you, a boy drops a bundle of reeds, gets scolded, and learns that in a productive garden, even clutter has a proper position. The garden itself offers natural opportunities too. Melon beds may be placed where walls cast brief morning or late afternoon shadows, where a row of taller crops breaks the wind, or where trees and built structures temper the fiercest exposure without plunging the plants into permanent gloom. Formal layouts can help or hinder this. A garden planned for beauty may create beneficial pockets of shelter. It may also produce very elegant mistakes. Symmetry is lovely until your seedlings are being roasted in mathematically perfect alignment. A quirky tidbit from the wider history of cultivation is that growers in many regions have long practiced temporary shading not only with structures but with objects that border on the comically improvised. Old baskets, mats, inverted pots, or leafy heaps shifted through the day. Once you notice this, the entire history of horticulture becomes a little more charming. Human civilization, at crucial moments, is often just someone putting a thing over another thing and hoping for the best. Admittedly, in this case the thing might save a melon prized by a noble household, which raises the stakes considerably for a maneuver that resembles clever backyard panic. There is a sensory softness to this part of the work. The rustle of reeds. The whisper of leaves brushing leaves. The brief cool pocket of shade on your face as you pass near a screen. The smell of damp soil still lingering under the mulch, trying its best against the climbing warmth. A gardener lifts one vine gently so that it sprawls in the preferred direction rather than tangling back into the basin. Another checks for singed edges on young leaves. They do not fuss theatrically. They intervene just enough, which may be the hardest skill of all. You begin to notice how shading works with the earlier strategies rather than replacing them. Dawn watering gives the roots a reserve. Shade beds hold that moisture where it counts. Mulch slows its loss. Shade then buys time for the reserves to matter. The whole system is layered. No single trick defeats summer. Together, they negotiate with it. This is why the melon survives, not because one miraculous method exists, but because several modest ones cooperate without asking for applause. Of course, too much shade has its own dangers. A vine pampered into softness may become vulnerable later. Stagnant air can invite mildew. Overprotection can delay ripening or encourage weak growth. Gardeners know this instinctively. The screens are not monuments. They are temporary companions, adjusted as the plants strengthen. There's almost a parental rhythm to it: shelter, then gradually withdrawal, all while pretending not to be emotional about the outcome. By noon, the value of every scrap of shade becomes obvious. The open ground beyond the protected beds shimmers. The brick edges of channels radiate heat. Even the breeze feels as though it has been preheated in a furnace and released with administrative indifference. Under the screens, however, the soil remains a little darker, a little cooler, the leaves less collapsed. It is not paradise, but then paradise in Mughal gardening is often built from very practical annoyances. You pause beside a row where the first true leaves have broadened, each plant now looking less like a hopeful accident and more like a committed vine. The worst of their infancy may soon pass. Yet the work will only become more complex from here, because these are not melons grown merely for the pleasure of watching something green live another day. These fruits are tied to appetite, display, and expectation. Somewhere beyond the beds, kitchens, stewards, and markets are already involved, whether they know it yet or not. And as the shaded seedlings settle into the summer light, you begin to sense the larger world waiting for them: the noble table, the palace demand, the city's hungry commerce, and the strange, social life of a fruit that becomes valuable the moment someone important decides it is. By the time the vines are no longer fragile little aristocrats hiding under reed screens, the garden begins to feel connected to places beyond itself. You can sense it in the change of attention. The workers still kneel in the dirt, still clear weeds, still adjust water and mulch and shade, but now the melons are becoming visible as actual future objects, things that can be counted, promised, compared, and eventually carried away. A fruit in the garden is one kind of reality. A fruit expected by a palace kitchen or desired in a city market is another. And in the Mughal world, where taste and status often hold hands like smug cousins, a melon can travel very quickly from humble vine to social currency. You walk past a bed where the fruits are swelling under their leaves, their rinds still mottled and immature, and already men are talking about them in the future tense. This row for the household. That patch perhaps for sale. Those particularly fine ones held back until they are judged at their best. It is a gentle reminder that gardening is rarely only about plants. It is about systems of demand. Someone always wants the harvest before the harvest exists. Modern supply chains did not invent this anxiety. They merely gave it clipboards. A mainstream historical fact anchors the whole scene. The Mughal court had a deep appetite for fruits, especially those associated with refinement, seasonality, and elite consumption. Chronicles, memoirs, and travel accounts all suggest a culture in which fruits could be prestigious gifts, desirable delicacies, and emblems of abundance. Melons, like mangoes, grapes, pomegranates, and other favored fruits, fit naturally into this courtly landscape of display and pleasure. The empire taxed grain, marched armies, and negotiated succession, yes, but it also took dessert very seriously. That seriousness filters downward into the garden. These melons are not anonymous produce. The finest among them may be destined for nobles who care very much about aroma, texture, and timing. A melon served too early is a disappointment. Too late, and it may turn mealy or split. A fruit bruised in transport loses dignity before it loses juice. Somewhere nearby, you can almost hear a steward asking exactly how many properly ripe melons will be ready in 3 days, as if nature can be bullied into compliance by inventory. And yet markets matter too. The Mughal city, especially a large one like Agra, Lahore, or Delhi, pulses with exchange. Garden produce does not belong only to emperors. Fruits move through bazaars, noble households, caravan routes, and urban kitchens. Some gardens are explicitly productive. Others are mixed spaces, ornamental and useful at once. The line between display and commerce is rarely neat. An elite garden may supply a household first, then spill surplus into networks of sale or gift. A market garden may adopt courtly varieties because prestige itself can be sold by the slice. Historians still argue whether the most famous fruits of the Mughal age were widely consumed across social ranks in meaningful quantity, or whether the finest varieties remain mostly symbols of elite access, admired more often than eaten by ordinary people. It is one of those questions where scale becomes slippery. Certainly many common people ate melons and other fruits when locally available. This is not a story in which only princes know what sweetness is. But the best watered, best tended, best transported fruits, especially out of difficult seasons, often drift toward money and rank the way cool shade drifts toward walls. You imagine the journey once these melons are harvested. Packed in baskets, cushioned perhaps with straw or leaves, loaded carefully because bruising is the enemy of both flavor and reputation. A cartwheel hits a rut. A bearer shifts the load. A steward inspects the fruit on arrival with a face suggesting he personally invented standards. The whole chain is oddly tense for something that will eventually be sliced and eaten in minutes. But that is the way with luxury. The less essential the thing, the more ceremonial the anxiety around it. There is a distinctly Mughal pleasure in making summer appear conquered. Imagine a shaded pavilion, perhaps a terrace overlooking water, where an elegantly chilled or at least carefully cooled melon arrives as though plucked from a gentler universe. The point is not only the taste, though the taste matters. The point is what the taste says. We have water. We have labor. We have skill. We have access to the right seeds, the right beds, the right hands, the right timing. We can create refreshment in weather that seems designed to insult mammals. A quirky tidbit from the broader Persian and South Asian world is that especially prized fruits could function as diplomatic or social gifts, carrying not just edible pleasure but connotations of place, favor, and refinement. It is a charmingly vulnerable form of prestige. Send a jeweled dagger, and it remains a jeweled dagger. Send a famous melon, and suddenly your reputation is rolling around in a basket hoping not to split before the recipient gets dramatic about it. Back in the beds, the workers continue their quiet triage. Fruits that look especially promising are watched more carefully. Vines are shifted so melons rest on dry ground or on bits of straw rather than sitting in moisture long enough to spot or soften. Leaves are sometimes adjusted to keep the sun from scorching an exposed rind. It is not enough for the fruit to mature. It must mature attractively. The gardener is now half nurse, half curator. And then there is the city's appetite for novelty. A fruit associated with a famous district, a particular noble estate, or a rare sweetness can gather a small aura. Travelers mention it. Vendors exaggerate it. Households boast of obtaining it. The market has always loved a story, and a melon with pedigree is still a story. You can almost hear a merchant describing his wares with solemn conviction, while a customer sniffs and pretends to be impossible to impress. Human beings have apparently been performing this exact theater for millennia. The labor hierarchy behind all this becomes more visible the closer the harvest approaches. The gardeners may know the fruit best, but they do not fully control where it goes. Estate managers allocate. Household officers claim. Cooks request. Servants carry. Sellers bargain. Wealth shapes access at every step. The melon, which began as a seed under a hill of earth, is now entering the social bloodstream. It can become a refreshment for the court, an item in urban commerce, a token in gift exchange, or a momentary luxury for someone lucky enough to buy one before the afternoon turns it soft. You stand at the edge of the plot and look across the swelling fruits under their leaves, and it strikes you that these melons are living two lives at once. One is botanical and intimate, root, water, leaf, heat, sugar, rind. The other is social and performative, taste, rank, trade, praise, disappointment. The gardeners must serve both. They must keep the plants alive in brutal weather and also satisfy a world that judges the final result with absurd confidence. A fruit this valued does not emerge from anonymous labor. It emerges from a structured world of hands, orders, and expectations. And as the day climbs hotter and the vines thicken around the growing melons, your attention shifts naturally from the fruit's destination to the people bent over the beds themselves. The men and boys whose skills, status, and sweat make this elegant summer illusion possible. The longer you remain in the garden, the harder it becomes to believe the old illusion that such places simply exist because powerful people desire them. Desire helps, certainly. Money helps. Water channels and walls and imperial taste help very loudly. But none of it matters without the layered human machinery moving through the beds from dawn onward. By now you have watched enough watering, shading, and fussing over vines to see the garden as it really is, a hierarchy in motion. Someone plans. Someone supervises. Someone remembers which patch was sown first. Someone hauls reeds. Someone cleans channels. Someone kneels in the dust and notices a leaf beginning to curl. Paradise, as ever, rests on staffing. You move along a narrow path between plots and start to sort the workers in your mind, not by their clothes alone, though garments, turbans, and posture tell part of the story, but by what each person does and how others respond. There are clearly skilled gardeners here, men with experience enough to make decisions rather than merely receive them. They judge soil, direct water, thin seedlings, and inspect fruits with the authority of memory. Then there are laborers, boys, carriers, animal handlers, and general hands who do the carrying, lifting, clearing, fetching, and endless repair that a productive garden requires. Above them hover overseers or estate officials whose relationship to dirt is more managerial. They may not know every vine personally, but they know very well whose displeasure descends if the melons arrive late or bland. A mainstream historical fact fits squarely into this scene. Mughal gardens, especially elite and imperial ones, relied on organized labor forces that could include gardeners, water lifters, builders, attendants, record keepers, and domestic staff. Court culture loved finished beauty, but maintaining that beauty required a permanent workforce. The empire's great visual order was not self-sustaining. It was brushed, swept, watered, pruned, weeded, dredged, and carried every single day by people whose names are often missing from the records. History has a very annoying habit of remembering the patron and forgetting the person holding the shovel. You watch one older gardener kneel by a vine and tap the soil with 2 fingers before giving a short instruction to a younger worker. The younger man nods, fetches a basket of dry litter, and returns to spread it around the bed. No speech about theory, no ceremony, just a transfer of knowledge through action. It reminds you how most practical expertise survives, not in a dramatic unveiling, but in repeated correction. Stand there. Not there. More water. Less. Lift the leaf. Leave the fruit. Watch the western side afternoon. 1,000 tiny instructions create what later looks like effortless abundance. The hierarchy is not only practical, it is social. Gardens attached to noble households or imperial domains belong to a wider ecosystem of patronage and obligation. Skilled horticultural workers may earn trust over years, even generations, becoming valued specialists within an estate. Others remain replaceable muscle. Payment, food, lodging, perquisites, seasonal rewards, or punishments likely vary by rank and household. The details shift across place and time, but the pattern is familiar. Expertise gets respect, though not always comfort. Labor gets necessity, though not always thanks. The melon, meanwhile, receives all the compliments. Historians still argue whether highly specialized horticultural knowledge in Mughal India was concentrated mostly among hereditary professional communities and estate servants, or whether it moved more fluidly among peasants, market gardeners, and courtly staff than the surviving evidence suggests. It is probably another braided answer. Skills travel with families, apprenticeships, marriages, migrations, military campaigns, and plain old opportunism. A good gardener is a valuable creature in any century. Someone notices. Someone tries to hire him away. Someone else claims his father already worked these beds and the knowledge belongs here. Agriculture can be surprisingly political before breakfast. You notice, too, how gender floats through the edges of the work even when the visible labor before you appears mostly male in this particular setting. In many South Asian agricultural systems, women participated deeply in cultivation, processing, and household food economies, though elite garden records and male observers often understate or flatten that contribution. In palace-adjacent spaces, labor may be more strictly structured by access and propriety. Yet knowledge about seeds, fruits, storage, and culinary use does not obey neat documentary boundaries. Someone's aunt somewhere almost certainly knows more about choosing a melon than the official inventory man ever will. A quirky tidbit survives in the wider early modern world of courtly estates. Specialist gardeners could acquire reputations almost like artisans, valued for their eye, their timing, or their ability to coax prized varieties in difficult conditions. The star gardener is not always visible in formal chronicles, but you can feel his presence in the way one man's opinion quiets others near a troublesome bed. Every profession eventually invents its own legend, and horticulture is no exception. Somewhere in history there is definitely a man who became insufferable because his melons were genuinely better than everyone else's. The physical burden of the work never goes away. Even with hierarchy, everyone near the beds is subject to heat. By mid-morning, tunics cling, necks darken with sweat. Hands carry the chalky memory of soil in every crease. Reeds scratch. Water sloshes. Mud cakes and dries. A laborer shoulders a bundle of cut branches for shade and walks with the resigned expression of someone who understands that the fruit being pampered today will be admired tomorrow by people who have never carried so much as a twig. You feel for him. You also feel for yourself, because just standing here is beginning to feel like slow roasting with scenery. And yet the mood is not joyless. There is banter, quick grins, muttered complaints, a joke about one melon growing fatter than a tax collector's purse. Another worker teases a boy for babying a vine as if it were his future bride. The sarcasm is light, the kind that keeps a day moving. Labor everywhere breeds wit because the alternative is dramatic weeping, and nobody has time for that before noon. The administrative side hovers nearby. In a large estate, work must be scheduled. Water turns may be allocated. Tools accounted for. Produce noted. If fruits are meant for household use, kitchen staff and stewards may coordinate with gardeners about ripening and harvest windows. The higher the status of the consumer, the more absurdly precise the expectations can become. Somewhere, you are sure, a man in cleaner clothes than anyone here is very concerned about melons while contributing nothing except pressure. Still, not all power flows one way. Skilled workers possess leverage of a quiet sort. They know which well runs sweet, which bed bakes fastest, which vine should be thinned, which fruit can wait 2 days and which must be cut by tomorrow dawn. A noble may own the garden, but the gardener interprets it. That matters. Expertise often survives precisely because authority cannot function without it. You pause near the water wheel again and watch the team moving in practice sequence, each person fitting into the larger rhythm without much wasted motion. The garden's hierarchies are real, uneven, and sometimes harsh, but they also create a coordination that the melon depends on. No single hand could manage all of this alone. It takes planners, watchers, lifters, weeders, carriers, and those few gifted souls who can look at a vine and somehow read its mood. As the sun edges higher and the workers spread out to their respective tasks, your attention softens from rank to sensation. Beneath hierarchy lies atmosphere, the dark shine of damp channels, the green sprawl of leaves, the whisper of reeds, the scent of wet earth lifting briefly before the day bakes it thinner. For all its labor and order, the garden is also a place of textures and sounds so gentle they almost hide the effort inside them. And before the next trouble arrives, as it always does, you find yourself settling into that sensory world, where melon growing becomes not just work or status, but an entire climate of smell, shade, and quiet repetition. The longer you stay among the vines, the more the garden stops feeling like a set of tasks and starts feeling like an atmosphere you wear on your skin. The hierarchies are still there, of course. Someone is still keeping count, someone is still barking a correction, and someone is still carrying more than any philosopher of paradise ever mentions. But now, as the work settles into repetition, your senses begin to notice what the records usually do not. The scent of damp earth fading upward as the sun climbs. The green smell of bruised leaves where a vine has been shifted. The mineral coolness that rises briefly from a channel before noon steals it. It is the sort of environment that makes you understand why gardens occupy such a large place in Mughal imagination. They do not merely look ordered. They feel like relief arranged with intention. You walk beside a line of shallow watercourses, and their sound is quieter than you expected, not the dramatic rush of a mountain stream, but a discreet slipping and murmuring, as if the garden is trying not to wake anyone important. The channels glint in broken fragments of light. On one side lie the formal features that court painters love, stone edging balanced paths, perhaps a terrace beyond. On the other side, the practical beds continue their gentle sprawl, melon leaves spread low and wide, silver green in places, darker where the shade holds. The marriage of geometry and biology is never perfect, but here it comes close enough to look effortless. Naturally, that means it is held together by a lot of unseen fussing. A mainstream historical fact threads through this moment. Mughal garden culture was deeply shaped by the idea of the garden as a sensory and symbolic space, influenced by Persianate concepts of ordered nature, running water, fragrance, shade, and cultivated pleasure. Gardens were places for rest, sociability, display, and reflection as much as for productive planting. Water, scent, and seasonal bloom mattered immensely. Even when a garden included useful crops, it was rarely only useful. It was part theater, part climate control, part statement that civilization had managed, however briefly, to behave itself. The melons participate in this sensory world in their own quiet way. Their vines spread like cool cloth over the soil. Their leaves make a softer rustle than the sharper plants nearby. If you brush a stem or pinch a leaf, there is that faint bitter green smell, dry and alive at once. Some of the fruits are still small enough to hide completely. Others are beginning to show under the canopy like secret lanterns. One has a skin faintly netted, another smooth. You are tempted to inspect them all with ridiculous seriousness, as though you have been promoted to assistant melon whisperer. The garden does this to you. It seduces you into caring about details that would sound absurd at breakfast. And the earth, always the earth, contributes its own perfume. After dawn watering, the smell rises rich and dark, almost sweet, then thins as the hours pass. Mixed into it are traces of manure, ash, damp straw, crushed weeds, warm brick, and the occasional waft of something floral drifting from a more ornamental quarter of the grounds. Mughal gardens often mingled utility and delight. Fruit trees, flowers, herbs, and water features could coexist, making the air itself layered. You inhale and catch basil or mint from somewhere nearby. Then damp clay. Then leaf sap. Then dust again, because summer always gets the last word. Historians still argue whether the sensory ideals praised in elite descriptions of Mughal gardens match the everyday experience of working gardeners, or whether literary accounts smoothed over the harsher textures of sweat, smells, mud, and animal labor. Quite possibly both are true at once. A noble strolling at dusk and a laborer clearing channels at dawn inhabit the same garden differently. One hears soothing water. The other hears a maintenance issue. Yet the physical beauty is real even when the work is hard. That is one of history's more annoying habits. Splendor and effort keep sharing the same address. A breeze wanders through at last, and for a moment the whole melon quarter seems to exhale. Leaves shift. Reed screens click softly. The surface of a channel trembles. Somewhere higher in the garden a pigeon flaps down with the heavy confidence of a bird that has never once paid taxes. You hear footfalls on gravel, the murmur of two workers discussing whether one vine should be turned slightly, the distant creak of the water-lifting gear, and farther off still the muffled life of the household beyond the garden walls. Sound here travels oddly. Water softens it. Trees catch it. Walls fold it back. The result is a kind of living hush, not silence but a polite conspiracy of noise. A quirky tidbit from courtly garden culture is that fragrance mattered so much in some elite settings that gardeners and attendants were attentive not just to flowers but to the timing of scent itself, what released in morning, what deepened at dusk, what lingered after watering. You can imagine how a productive garden might benefit from this broader sensory literacy. A good gardener notices smell because smell reveals things: dampness, rot, healthy growth, stagnant water, bruised stems. It is not all romance. Sometimes the nose is simply management in a poetic disguise. As you drift farther along the beds, you start to see how the visual texture changes across the day. Early light sharpens edges, making every leaf vein and soil crumb look distinct. Later, the glare flattens everything into broad planes of brightness and shadow. Under those conditions, the melons almost disappear beneath the vines, pale and round, tucked into pockets of dimness. It is a strangely soothing sight. Not because nothing is happening, but because so much is happening quietly. Sugar is forming. Roots are drinking. Moisture is retreating downward. Leaves are negotiating with sun. The garden is full of processes too slow to see and too important to ignore. Even the workers seem to move with a softened rhythm here compared with the hard urgency of dawn watering. A man kneels to lift a leaf and check a fruit, then settles it back as carefully as if tucking a child into bed. Another pinches off a wayward shoot. A boy carries a basket of pulled weeds and pauses for one deeply theatrical sigh that deserves an audience. He does not get one. History is cruel that way. You find a patch where the earth remains notably cooler, and realize how much of this sensory world is engineered. Shade, mulch, moisture, orientation, timing, none of it accidental. The calm you feel in the garden is made, not found. That may be the loveliest thing about it. Relief here is a craft. The hush, the dampness, the drifting scent of green things surviving heat, all of it comes from repeated labor shaped into atmosphere. And yet atmosphere is fragile. One bad watering turn, one clogged channel, one burst of insects, one spell of hot wind too fierce even for reed screens, and the sensory harmony could turn sharp very quickly. The same earth that smells sweet after water can smell sour with rot. The same leaves that whisper pleasantly can crisp at the edges. You sense, beneath all this softness, the constant possibility of reversal. So you linger a little longer with the murmur of channels and the perfume of wet soil fading into sun, knowing the garden's calm is earned and temporary. It is a place of immense subtlety, but not invulnerability. Beneath the leaves, among the roots, beyond the pleasant green hush, trouble is always waiting its turn. Small jaws, invisible blights, bad luck, and the sort of summer mischief that can undo a season while everyone is still admiring how beautifully the light falls on the water. The garden has been almost indecently lovely up to this point, all wet earth perfume, careful shade, and melon leaves behaving as though they appreciate the effort. But history, like gardening, never lets beauty sit still for long. Trouble enters quietly. Not with trumpets, naturally. Not even with a dramatic villain's cape. It arrives as a curled edge on a leaf, a powdery patch where yesterday there was only green, a fruit resting too long on damp soil, or a line of insects proceeding with the confidence of tiny tax collectors. You begin to understand why the gardeners never fully relax. Paradise has pests. You crouch near one bed and notice a leaf stippled pale, its surface marked by feeding you would have missed an hour ago. Nearby, another plant looks a shade duller than its neighbors. One fruit has a suspicious soft spot where it meets the ground. None of these problems are spectacular. That is exactly why they are dangerous. Catastrophe in a melon garden often begins as a detail. A little mildew here. A chewed stem there. A little extra moisture trapped under a cluster of leaves. Enough of those details, and the entire noble fantasy of cool summer fruit begins to wobble like an overloaded cartwheel. A mainstream historical fact belongs here. Pre-modern growers across South Asia, as elsewhere, contended constantly with crop threats including insects, fungal diseases, rot, irregular watering, and extreme weather, and they developed practical methods: sanitation, spacing, airflow, ash, hand removal, timing of irrigation, and selective sacrifice of damaged plants to reduce losses. There were no modern chemical sprays waiting in a tidy shed. Survival depended on observation, prevention, and a willingness to become personally acquainted with things that chew. The gardeners moved through the melon quarter with a sharper kind of attention than before, and you realize this may be one of the true markers of expertise. Anyone can admire a thriving plant. The real professionals can spot the beginning of failure. One lifts a leaf and rubs its underside with thumb and forefinger, checking for tiny pests. Another breaks off a stem already wilting suspiciously. A third clears extra growth from around a fruit to improve airflow, then pauses to inspect the soil below it. This is not panic. It is routine vigilance. The garden has enemies, but it also has people with opinions. Insects are among the most annoying. Beetles, borers, aphid-like sap feeders, caterpillars. Different seasons and regions bring different nuisances, but the principle stays the same. Small mouths create large resentments. A vine weakened by heat is more vulnerable. A bed too damp after sunrise invites trouble. A patch too crowded becomes an insect buffet with terrible management. So the gardeners thin, clean, inspect, and remove. Sometimes a damaged leaf is sacrificed. Sometimes an entire weak plant is taken out to protect the stronger ones nearby. Agriculture can be heartbreakingly pragmatic. Sentiment is charming, but it does not stop mildew. Historians still argue whether the medical and agricultural theories circulating in the Mughal world, especially humoral ideas about balance, moisture, heat, and corruption, influenced how growers interpreted plant disease, or whether practical treatment remained mostly empirical and separate from learned theory. The boundary is probably blurrier than modern people like to imagine. A gardener may not write a learned treatise, but he definitely notices when heat plus damp plus stale air creates a miserable result. He may express that in the language of imbalance rather than microbes, but the underlying observation can still be sharp. You come upon a fruit that has been gently lifted onto a bit of straw or dry litter so it does not sit directly on moist soil. This small act seems almost tender, and in a sense it is, but mostly it is anti-rot strategy. Contact with damp earth for too long can blemish or soften the rind, especially when heat encourages every bad idea at once. A melon meant for a noble table cannot arrive looking like it lost an argument with the ground. Appearance matters. The fruit must be sweet, yes, but also presentable enough to survive the gaze of someone wearing rings. Then there is mildew, that pale dusty insult that can settle on leaves in still, humid conditions or after poorly timed watering. You can imagine how quickly a garden quarter becomes uneasy when fungal trouble appears. Too much lushness becomes a liability. The very shade that once protected seedlings can, if mismanaged, hold stale moisture where disease likes to linger. So the gardeners adapt. More spacing here. Less crowding there. Damaged growth removed. Water kept to the root zone as much as possible, and not splashed thoughtlessly over everything like cheerful chaos. Prevention is rarely glamorous, but neither is explaining to a steward why half the melon patch now resembles a failed pastry experiment. A quirky tidbit from broader agricultural folklore is that ash was often valued not only as a soil amendment but also, in some contexts, as a drying or deterrent material around vulnerable plants. Whether every application worked exactly as hoped is another matter, but ash had the advantage of being available, practical, and wonderfully theatrical when dusted onto a damp problem. Human beings love nothing more than throwing a powder at a crisis and feeling briefly in control. Bad luck, of course, does not always wear a scientific face. A hot wind can arrive from nowhere and take a whole bed from merely thirsty to deeply offended in an afternoon. A worker can misjudge irrigation and leave one section stressed. A channel can clog. A goat can demonstrate an unexpected commitment to trespassing. Even birds become suspects once fruit begins to sweeten, though they are usually less destructive than the more dramatic stories suggest. Still, nothing sharpens a gardener's glare like discovering that some feathered opportunist has sampled tomorrow's best melon before anyone with rank gets the chance. You notice how often the response to danger is cleanliness and order. Weeds pulled. Damaged fruits removed before they sour nearby air and attract more trouble. Beds kept open enough for inspection. Tools and litter moved out of the way. It is not only aesthetics. Tidiness in the melon quarter is a form of defense. Disorder hides problems. Order exposes them early. The Mughal love of controlled space suddenly feels less decorative and more horticulturally sensible. And yet not every symptom is easy to read. One vine wilts because of root damage. Another because yesterday's watering never reached deep enough. Another because the soil stayed too wet. Another because the heat simply decided to be personal. This is the part where experience becomes almost eerie. A good gardener looks once, touches the earth, lifts a leaf, maybe slices into a dying stem, and somehow knows more than seems fair. You stand nearby contributing nothing except admiration and body heat. By late afternoon, the melon quarter still looks peaceful from a distance. That is the maddening thing. A visitor strolling through might notice only green leaves, orderly beds, and a few handsome fruits swelling in the shade. He would not see the chewed stem removed at dawn, the suspicious leaf burned or discarded, the fruit turned onto dry bedding, the ash lightly spread, the water withheld from one patch and increased in another. He would assume abundance simply happened. You, unfortunately, know better now. The vines settle as the heat slowly begins to ease, and the gardeners make one more careful pass, scanning for tomorrow's problems before night hides them. Their war is not dramatic, but it is constant. Insects, rot, mildew, hot wind, damp soil, bad timing, bad luck, each one capable of spoiling sweetness before it reaches the table. And still the melons grow, because vigilance keeps making tiny corrections against decay. You leave the beds with the uneasy respect that every good garden eventually inspires, admiration mixed with the knowledge of how much can go wrong. Yet in the Mughal world, plants were not judged only by gardeners. They were also folded into ideas about the body itself, about heat and coolness, appetite and balance, digestion and health. Which means the fate of these melons will soon move from the beds to the physicians, kitchens, and courtly theories that decide not only how to grow a fruit in summer, but how to eat one without offending the delicate machinery of the human self. By the time the melons are large enough to attract anxious glances from stewards and predatory glances from insects, they have already become more than fruit. In the Mughal world, as in much of the broader Persianate and South Asian medical tradition, food sits very close to medicine. You do not simply eat because you are hungry. You eat according to season, temperament, digestion, age, and the ongoing drama of what your body is thought to contain too much or too little of. Which means that somewhere beyond the melon beds, in cooler rooms with cushions and serious eyebrows, physicians are thinking about whether these fruits soothe summer heat, burden the stomach, or require some balancing companion before anyone respectable starts slurping with confidence. You drift from the garden's practical edge toward the household world that waits to receive the harvest, and the atmosphere changes. The air here still carries warmth, but it smells less of damp soil and more of storage jars, cloth, and the faint sharpness of herbs. Servants move in and out with trays, pitchers, bundles of leaves, baskets of produce. A hakim, or physician trained in the learned traditions of Greco-Arabic and Persian medicine that deeply shaped elite medical culture in Mughal India, becomes part of the story whether he appears in person or not. His voice hovers over the fruit like a second kind of weather. The mainstream historical fact is clear: the Mughal court, like many Islamic and South Asian elite societies of the early modern period, was influenced strongly by humoral medicine, often called Unani in South Asia, which understood health through balances of qualities such as hot, cold, moist, and dry. Foods were categorized according to these qualities and their effects on the body. Summer heat, digestion, temperament, and regimen all mattered. A melon, therefore, is never just a melon. It is also an event in bodily theory. And from the perspective of that theory, melons are fascinating. Their watery coolness makes them attractive in hot weather, when bodies are thought to be taxed by summer's heat and dryness. Their sweetness suggests nourishment and comfort. Their moisture suggests relief. But there is a catch, because historical medicine rarely gives with one hand without wagging a finger with the other. Cooling foods can be beneficial, yes, but they may also be considered difficult for some stomachs, especially if eaten in excess, eaten at the wrong time, or combined unwisely. The great historical truth of diet is that every delightful thing eventually acquires a footnote. You can almost hear the advice forming. Eat the melon ripe, but not overripe. Eat it at the proper hour. Perhaps do not immediately chase it with something considered incompatible. Perhaps pair it with salt, spice, or another ingredient believed to aid digestion. Perhaps avoid it if your constitution runs too cold or too moist already, which sounds suspiciously like the physician's way of making sure he can never be fully contradicted. If you thrive, he was right. If you don't, your temperament was at fault. It is an admirably durable system. Historians still argue whether humoral dietary advice at the Mughal court significantly governed everyday elite eating habits or whether practical pleasure frequently outran medical caution in actual household life. The answer, naturally, is both. Learned people can recite the perfect regimen, and then still overeat something exquisite when summer is unbearable, and the melon is particularly good. Courtly medicine is one thing. A plate of fragrant chilled fruit in June is another. Human beings have always been very committed to theory until dessert arrives. As you follow the fruit from garden logic into household logic, you see how the two worlds overlap. Gardeners worry about heat, moisture, timing, and rot. Physicians worry about heat, moisture, timing, and the human body. The vocabulary differs slightly, but the obsession with balance remains. Summer is the enemy in both realms. The melon is a kind of negotiated truce. A quirky tidbit from the wider early modern medical world is that physicians and dietary writers could be astonishingly specific about fruit etiquette. What to eat before it, after it, with it, or never in the same sitting if you valued a calm stomach and a dignified evening. Melons in particular often attracted caution because their watery flesh and perceived coolness made them both desirable and suspect. You almost have to admire the confidence with which historical experts could turn a simple snack into a constitutional gamble. Eat carelessly, and suddenly you are not enjoying fruit. You are conducting an experiment on your humors. Cooling techniques add another layer. In elite households, fruits might be stored in shaded places, cooled in water, or served from spaces designed to preserve freshness as much as possible in hot weather. Not refrigeration, of course. History remains stubbornly inconvenient, but still a careful pursuit of temperature relief. Imagine the delight of receiving a melon that has been protected from the sun, perhaps rinsed or cooled, then cut at the right moment so its flesh feels gentler than the air around it. It is not hard to see why such fruit becomes more than nourishment. It becomes an experience of controlled climate, a tiny edible rebellion against summer. You picture a nobleman or courtier receiving slices with composed gratitude while privately feeling a level of emotional dependence that would be embarrassing to admit. There is something very human in that. Empires conquer territories. Individuals cling to seasonal fruit. Yet concern remains. Too much melon, especially if greed outruns digestion, might be blamed for bloating, looseness, or a general household atmosphere of regret. A physician might recommend moderation or paring. A cautious servant might mention that the Hakim advised patience. Someone will ignore this. Someone always does. Across the centuries, the most reliable fact in dietary history may be that good advice loses badly to immediate deliciousness. The fruit's medicinal reputation also shapes who receives it and when. In a hot season, a household may value melons not merely for pleasure but for their role in restoring comfort to overheated bodies. They suit convalescents in some contexts, healthy elites in others, and anyone with the social standing to have their bodily equilibrium treated as a matter of consequence. Whether common people enjoy similar beliefs in local forms is likely, though documented differently. Practical dietary wisdom travels far beyond courts. A farmer's grandmother can have stronger opinions on cooling foods than any palace physician, and sometimes with better bedside manners. As evening edges closer, you begin to understand why melon growing carries such prestige in this world. The fruit sits at the meeting point of horticulture, medicine, and luxury. It is difficult to raise well in heat, desirable to eat in heat, and wrapped in theories about how to survive heat. It is comfort validated by scholarship. A gardener grows the fruit, a servant carries it, a cook prepares it, and a hakim explains why you should be grateful but not reckless. It takes an entire civilization to enjoy one slice properly. And then, just as you begin to smile at the image of solemn men debating digestion over a bowl of melon, another layer enters the scene, the outsider's gaze. Travelers, merchants, envoys, and curious visitors move through Mughal spaces constantly, noticing fruits, gardens, and courtly habits with varying levels of accuracy and restraint. Some admire. Some misunderstand. Some exaggerate for readers back home who have never seen a summer melon raised under this kind of pressure. which means the vines and their fruit are about to leave not only the garden and the dining room, but the empire's own self-understanding, passing into the stories foreigners tell when they try, and often fail, to describe what exactly makes these gardens so memorable. By now the melons have acquired enough significance that they begin to attract one of history's most reliable hazards: commentary from outsiders. No empire, however self-assured, escapes the foreign traveler with a notebook, an appetite, and a tendency to confuse one memorable afternoon for a total understanding of an entire civilization. The Mughal world receives merchants, envoys, missionaries, soldiers of fortune, physicians, adventurers, and men who are mostly just professionally nosy. They pass through gardens, taste fruits, admire waterworks, and then go home, or write home, trying to explain what they have seen. Sometimes they notice something real. Sometimes they notice themselves noticing it, which is much less useful. You move outward from the intimate routines of gardeners and physicians into the looser zone where display matters. A garden, after all, is not only worked, it is shown. Visitors are brought through avenues of trees, along channels, across terraces, under pavilions, and if fortune and timing align, toward the fruits that prove summer has been politely subdued. A well-grown melon becomes evidence. It says something about climate mastery, about the household's resources, about taste. It may also say that several exhausted men have been awake since before dawn, but that part is usually omitted from the charming account. A mainstream historical fact settles the scene. Foreign travelers to Mughal India in the 16th and 17th centuries often commented on the splendor of gardens, the abundance of fruits, and the refinement of elite consumption, even if their observations were filtered through their own tastes and preconceptions. Writers such as François Bernier, Niccolao Minucci, and others left impressions of courtly life, landscapes, and foodways that modern historians still mine carefully, with one eyebrow raised. Travel writing is a marvelous source and a terrible witness at the same time. You can almost picture the visitor arriving in heat, grateful for shade, trying to look suitably worldly while secretly being delighted by the sight of water gliding through ordered channels. Perhaps he is offered fruit. Perhaps he sees melons carried in baskets, or hears them praised by local hosts. Perhaps someone, eager to represent Mughal abundance properly, makes sure the best produce is visible at just the right moment. Hospitality has always included a theatrical element. The visitor thinks he has stumbled into truth. In reality, truth has been tidied for company. Still, there is no reason to imagine all praise is fake. Mughal gardens really were impressive, and high-quality fruits really did circulate through elite and urban settings in notable ways. A visitor from a different climate or season would have reason to marvel. To encounter delicately tended melons in oppressive summer, within landscapes shaped by water and symmetry, could genuinely feel like evidence of cultivated sophistication. Even the skeptical outsider may find himself becoming sentimental over produce, which is one of the lovelier ways empires soften resistance. Historians still argue whether European travelers systematically exaggerated Mughal luxury to entertain readers back home, or whether later historians have sometimes overcorrected by treating every admiring description as suspect performance. Both distortions are possible. A garden can be magnificent and selectively presented. A melon can be delicious and politically useful. A traveler can be observant in one paragraph and ludicrous in the next. Human consistency has never been strong in warm weather. You imagine the misunderstandings too. A visitor sees a melon bed in an elite garden and assumes all Indian horticulture looks like this. Another hears that certain varieties are esteemed and concludes, with the confidence of a man 2 weeks into the subcontinent, that he now understands local taste completely. A third tastes a melon at precisely the right moment, and writes as if every fruit in the empire attains that standard daily by divine favor. These are familiar sins. Every tourist has at least one sentence in them that deserves gentle confiscation. A quirky tidbit from early modern travel culture is that foreign observers often became strangely competitive about describing fruits abroad, as though discovering the sweetness of a melon or mango personally enhanced their authority. There is something wonderfully human in that. A man can survive sea voyages, political intrigue, dysentery, and several poor lodging houses, then suddenly become lyrical because someone handed him a slice of fruit in the shade. Civilization, apparently, is one good snack away from sincerity. As you move through a guest-facing part of the grounds, you see how much of the garden's message depends on contrast. Outside, heat, dust, glare, unruly streets, the ordinary grind of summer. Inside, water, geometry, green shade, cultivated abundance. Even if the labor behind it remains mostly invisible, the sensory effect is real. Visitors feel the difference in their bodies before they ever explain it in prose. Coolness is persuasive. Scent is persuasive. A ripe melon served at the right moment is practically a diplomatic argument. And local hosts are not passive in this exchange. They boast, compare, and direct attention. This canal was newly improved. That bed produced especially well. These melons are from a favored strain. Those fruits rival any from a famous district. Pride travels easily in gardens. So does rivalry. One noble household would not mind at all if a visitor departed convinced that its produce surpassed that of a regional competitor by a full poetic degree. Horticulture becomes reputation made edible. The gardeners, meanwhile, remain mostly in the background, though they are the unacknowledged authors of the entire experience. A visitor may praise the owner, the design, the abundance, even the climate-defying skill of the place in general, while missing the individuals who adjusted shade screens, felt the soil at dawn, and turned fruits onto dry bedding to keep them from spotting. This is the old problem again. Labor creates marvels. Memory promotes management. You pause near a group of servants preparing fruit to be carried inward, and it is impossible not to think about all the layers each melon now carries. Local knowledge, Central Asian memory, water engineering, soil craft, labor hierarchy, dietary theory, elite appetite, and now foreign observation. All of that wrapped in a rind. No wonder people write about fruit with suspicious intensity. And yet travel accounts, however flawed, do preserve something important, the sense that Mughal cultivation impressed contemporaries. Outsiders noticed the gardens because the gardens were noticeable. They noticed the fruits because the fruits were not incidental. A summer melon, properly grown and properly presented, could stand for a whole system of cultivated order that visitors found difficult to ignore. But one traveler's praise does not tell the whole story of an empire. Not every region grows the same way. Not every garden enjoys the same water, the same cool nights, the same soil, or the same labor resources. Beyond the better-known centers lie other landscapes, other techniques, and other gardeners making their own bargains with heat. And as your imagination follows the melon outward from courtly display, the map of the empire begins to widen, toward Kashmir's milder air, toward harsher plains, toward regional methods and rival gardens where summer sweetness is won under very different terms. The traveler leaves with his opinions, the steward with his lists, and the garden with its routines, but the empire itself keeps stretching far beyond any single set of melon beds. Once you step outside the immediate orbit of one noble estate, the Mughal world begins to feel less like a uniform style and more like a patchwork of climates making polite, stubborn arguments with one another. The same imperial taste for good fruit may exist across the realm, but the conditions under which that fruit is raised can differ wildly. A melon in Kashmir has one childhood. A melon on the hotter plains has quite another. And if you have learned anything by now, It is that plants remember their childhoods more reliably than courtiers remember promises. You begin, naturally, with the fantasy region. Kashmir, tucked into the empire's imagination as a place of beauty, lakes, and cooler air, has long been associated with gardens and relief from the furnace of the plains. Mughal emperors loved it. Jahangir in particular is famously linked to Kashmir, and Mughal patronage there helped shape some of the most celebrated garden landscapes in South Asia. The mainstream historical fact, then, is simple. Kashmir occupied a special place in Mughal garden culture, prized for its climate, scenery, and suitability for refined horticultural expression. If the plains were an argument with heat, Kashmir was the part of the empire where the weather occasionally agreed to stop being rude. In such a region, melon growing does not become effortless, exactly, but the terms of negotiation change. Cooler nights can help fruit quality. Moisture patterns differ. The pressure to shade every tender stage may ease. Water may still matter enormously, of course, because water always matters, but the whole enterprise is not carried out under the same relentless afternoon assault you have been sweating through on the plains. A gardener there might worry about different timing, different soils, different ripening windows. You can almost hear the smugness drifting downhill already. Yes, very difficult work, this gardening, though of course the evenings are delightful. Infuriating. Back on the plains, by contrast, ingenuity must often compensate for climate brutality. In the hotter stretches of North India, where summer winds can feel like someone has opened a kiln and pointed it at your face, every earlier trick becomes more important. Dawn watering, shaped beds, mulch, temporary shade, careful spacing, and a near-spiritual relationship with soil moisture. The same melon desire persists, but its fulfillment requires more intervention. A fine fruit raised here carries, in a sense, a little more argument inside it. It is sweetness won from hostility. Historians still argue whether the prestige of cooler regions like Kashmir caused later observers to overstate their horticultural superiority, or whether lowland gardeners in more punishing climates were actually more technically inventive because they had to be. It is a good question, and a fair one. Ease can produce elegance, but difficulty often produces craft. A gardener who has to outweed brutal heat every week may know tricks a lakeside favorite never needs. On the other hand, if your nights are kinder and your water more forgiving, perhaps your fruit develops subtleties no amount of desperate mulch can imitate. Empires, like family dinners, are full of regional rivalries nobody fully resolves. As you move through this wider map, other zones appear. Riverine districts with richer alluvial soils. Drier regions where water control determines everything. Suburban belts around major cities where market demand pushes growers toward intensive cultivation. Estate gardens where ornament and productivity share space uneasily. Humble kitchen plots where methods overlap with elite practice but goals are more immediate. The techniques may rhyme even when the social worlds do not. A melon does not care whether it grows for an emperor or a cookshop. It only cares whether its roots are cool, and its leaves are not being assaulted by noon. A quirky tidbit from the broader history of South Asian horticulture is that regional pride in local produce could become astonishingly specific, with certain districts gaining reputations for particular fruits not unlike later fame for mangoes, citrus, or grapes. Human beings adore saying, with great seriousness, that the really proper version of something comes only from a very particular place. Often they are right. Just as often they are defending childhood memories with agricultural vocabulary. You picture gardeners across the empire comparing notes in fragmentary ways through movement, service, merchants, marriage connections, military transfer, patronage, and gossip. One man learns a watering trick in Lahore and carries it south. Another hears of a favored strain from Kabul or Samarkand and tries it under local conditions with mixed emotional results. A third adapts a shade method better suited to his district's wind. Knowledge in an empire is rarely centralized as neatly as maps suggest. It drifts. It sticks. It mutates. Sometimes the official version lags far behind what experienced hands already know. And then there is scale. In one place, a melon garden may be attached to a grand residence with waterworks and labor to spare. In another, the same fruit emerges from more modest means, cultivated with astonishing care in a patch close to a well. Regional comparison is not only about climate, it is about resources. Water-lifting devices, access to manure, the availability of reeds for shading, proximity to markets, protection from theft, and labor itself all matter. A court can purchase comfort for its fruit. A poorer grower must improvise it. You find something deeply soothing in the thought that across this huge imperial geography, people are all making slightly different bargains with the same summer problem. One district trusts deeper basins. Another prefers lighter soil. One watches the western sun with paranoia. Another worries more about late damp. Local habit becomes local wisdom, repeated until it feels obvious to those inside it, and mysterious to everyone else. Even within a single city, rival gardens might take pride in distinct methods or varieties. One noble's melons are praised for fragrance, another's for size, another's for early ripening. One market quarter swears by fruits grown upriver, another by those from a sandy tract outside town. You can almost hear the arguments in low voices over cut slices and raised eyebrows. Taste, after all, is never just taste. It is memory, pride, class, and the very old human hobby of insisting your preference is objective truth. As evening begins to cool the edges of the day, the empire's melon story gathers itself into a larger pattern. There is no single Mughal method frozen perfectly across every region. There is instead a shared aspiration, cool, sweet fruit in hot weather, met by local adjustments, inherited traditions, imported tastes, and practical compromise. That may be the most historically honest picture of all. Empire's Project Unity. Gardens reveal adaptation. And adaptation does not end in the beds. However differently the fruit is grown from Kashmir to the plains, it still reaches the same intimate human moment at the end, the cutting, the serving, the offering of slices across rank and etiquette. Which means your path now bends from climate and technique toward the charged little theater of consumption, where a melon is no longer merely successful agriculture but an object of manners, observation, and the surprisingly delicate politics of who gets the sweetest piece. By the time a melon leaves the vine, it has already lived several lives, botanical, social, medical, regional, and mildly theatrical. But the strangest transformation happens at the very end, when all that patient labor is condensed into the small, careful drama of serving it. You might think fruit simply arrives, is cut, and disappears into appreciative mouths. That would be the sensible version. History, however, prefers ceremony. So now you find yourself not in the beds and not fully in the kitchen either, but in that charged space between harvest and consumption, where etiquette hovers over the knife like a particularly judgmental ghost. The melons chosen for immediate use are carried inward with more care than many minor officials receive. Their rinds are wiped. Their ripeness is judged by touch, scent, and experience. One is set aside as not quite ready. Another, perhaps slightly overconfident in aroma, is marked for quicker use. The best specimens are handled almost reverently, though not so reverently that a servant will not still mutter under his breath when asked to fetch them twice because someone of rank changed his mind in mid-afternoon. Prestige is exhausting for everyone nearby. A mainstream historical fact fits neatly here. Elite Mughal food culture placed real emphasis on presentation, seasonality, and proper service, with fruits often appearing in curated forms at courtly and noble settings. Dining and refreshment were not merely about sustenance. They expressed refinement, hierarchy, generosity, and control over resources. The serving of fruit could therefore carry social meaning beyond its taste. A slice offered at the right time, in the right company, said something about the host's cultivation almost as much as the gardener's. You watch the preparation begin. A servant tests the knife, another brings a tray, another lays cloth beneath the fruit so it does not roll and humiliate the household. For one brief moment the whole melon sits there round and inscrutable, having survived sun, pests, overwatering, underwatering, and human ambition, only to meet its fate in a room where everyone suddenly becomes an expert. This too is one of history's constants. Once food reaches the table, opinions multiply faster than melon seeds. The cut matters. A clean split reveals the interior, the color of the flesh, the neatness of the seed cavity, the promise or disappointment of texture. There is always a tiny pause. Even in a modest household, that reveal has suspense. In a noble one, the suspense is just dressed better. A good melon opens fragrant, cool-smelling, the flesh firm but yielding, the seeds glistening in their chamber like a small treasure someone forgot to tax. A mediocre melon opens into polite silence. No courtly accomplishment has ever fully erased the human ability to look betrayed by fruit. Servants remove seeds, cut wedges, arrange slices. Perhaps the fruit is served plain. Perhaps with a little salt. Perhaps with cooling accompaniments, depending on household habit and medical caution. Perhaps someone murmurs that it should not be taken after certain dishes. Perhaps someone immediately ignores that. The Hakim's advice survives right up until appetite arrives, at which point the human body develops a remarkable commitment to selective hearing. Historians still argue whether elite Mughal etiquette around fruit service was rigidly codified in most households, or whether actual practice varied widely according to region, rank, and occasion. That is hardly surprising. Formal courts tend to generate rules, while daily life tends to smudge them. One prince may prefer careful sequencing and visual elegance. Another may simply want the coldest possible melon brought before the room turns into a tandoor with cushions. Ceremony, like rind thickness, can vary. You begin to notice rank distributed through slices. Who is served first, who receives the choicest section near the heart, who gets a smaller wedge, who merely watches, who carries the tray and never tastes unless something remains. In a stratified society, even refreshment can become a map of power. The sweetest piece does not float randomly to the nearest deserving soul. It usually travels upward. Somewhere, some exhausted gardener would probably like a word. Yet sharing matters too. A host offering fruit demonstrates generosity and abundance. A superior sending melons to an inferior may communicate favor. A noble household distributing slices among guests, kin, attendants, and favored dependents turns a seasonal delicacy into a social gesture. Fruit is fleeting, which makes it useful. Jewelry lasts. A melon must be enjoyed now, and therefore becomes a gift of the moment, a little edible diplomacy. A quirky tidbit from the wider early modern culture of fruit enjoyment is that people could become surprisingly attached to the correct way to cut or serve certain fruits, with debates over neatness, waste, and appearance carrying much more intensity than an outsider might expect. There is something almost reassuring in this. Entire empires rise and falter, but somebody in every century is still annoyed that another person sliced the fruit wrong. The scene around you is intimate in a way the garden was not. Out among the beds, the drama belonged to weather and labor. Here it belongs to glances. A guest compliments the fragrance. Another asks where the melon was grown, and suddenly the answer carries implications about region, taste, and household competence. Someone claims this year's fruits are finer than last year's. Someone else, in a masterpiece of subtle aggression, says they are excellent considering the heat. Social life has many weapons. One of them is qualified praise over summer produce. Even ordinary bodily gestures become revealing. The first bite slows the room. Relief passes across faces almost before anyone speaks. Summer fruit does that. It lowers the shoulders. It interrupts conversation. It creates a brief pocket of gratitude in which class, theory, and horticultural labor are all translated into cool sweetness against the tongue. You can understand why etiquette grows around it. Anything discomforting in hot weather acquires ritual almost automatically. And yet there is tension too, because ripe fruit waits for no one. Serve too late, and it softens. Let slices sit too long, and the heat takes back its tribute. Presentation, then, is a race against time. A tray carried across a courtyard must arrive before the flesh warms. A delay in one chamber may diminish delight in the next. The entire household briefly becomes a logistics operation in defense of texture. It is both absurd and deeply reasonable. You imagine the servants' private thoughts as they move in and out. The gentleman praising the cooling virtue of melon has not, perhaps, spent sunrise checking root moisture. The guest commenting on sweetness has not lifted a single reed screen. Yet there is also satisfaction in success. A well-served melon reflects credit backward through the chain. To steward, to kitchen, to garden, to the nameless hands that kept the vines alive. Recognition may not reach everyone equally, but the achievement still exists. The slice contains it. As twilight thickens outside, you feel how the serving of fruit completes the day's long arc from soil to status. Melons grown in heat are consumed as relief from heat. Melons raised through layered skill are judged in a few cool bites. Melons that embodied labor now embody manners. And because all rituals end, the plate's empty, the seeds gather in a bowl, the knives are wiped, and someone begins speaking of tomorrow's fruits. The cycle does not pause for admiration. Still, something lingers after the sweetness fades. These practices, watering at dawn, shaping soil, shading seedlings, choosing seeds, balancing medical advice with appetite, serving slices with rank-conscious grace, feel old enough to endure change. Courts may weaken. Patrons may vanish. Politics may rearrange the map. But techniques this practical have a way of surviving the people who once claimed them as ornaments. And so as the evening settles around the garden again, your thoughts begin to drift toward what happens when imperial shine starts to dull, yet the habits of cultivation remain. The melon slices disappear, the trays are cleared, and for a moment the whole world of the garden seems to rest in that pleasant aftertaste of sweetness and damp evening air. But history does not end at the edge of a well-served tray, and neither do gardening methods. Courts rise, flourish, grow fussy, spend too much, quarrel with their heirs, and eventually lose some of their glitter. Dynasties thin out. Power shifts. New rulers inherit old spaces with different priorities. Yet down in the beds, the soil still needs shaping, the water still needs lifting, and a melon still refuses to sweeten simply because an empire once felt important. That is one of the great quiet jokes of history. Politics changes quickly. Good gardening remains stubbornly practical. You begin to sense the later life of these Mughal techniques not through a single dramatic collapse, but through gradual rearrangement. A patron dies. A governor is replaced. A garden that once served an imperial household becomes attached to a provincial court, or a noble family, or a semi-neglected estate still trying to preserve appearances. Some pavilions crack. Some channels silt. Some fruit beds shrink. Yet the people who actually know how to grow things do not evaporate with the dynasty's prestige. They continue. They adapt. They sell their skill elsewhere. They teach sons, nephews, apprentices, laborers, neighbors. The aesthetic frame may dim, but the horticultural knowledge keeps slipping onward through time like water through a reused channel. A mainstream historical fact belongs here. Even as Mughal political power weakened in the 18th century, many elements of Mughal garden design, agricultural practice, and elite taste persisted in regional courts and local landscapes. Successor states, noble households, and urban elites continued to value gardens, fruit cultivation, and the cultural prestige attached to them, even when imperial central authority was fraying. Decline in politics rarely means instant amnesia in daily life. People do not wake up after a dynastic wobble and say, "Well, I suppose we shall never again mulch a melon." In fact, the survival of technique often depends precisely on its usefulness. Formal geometry may become expensive to maintain. Fountains may fail if revenue dries up. Marble can weather. But dawn watering, raised beds, shade screens, manure, seed selection, and fruit handling are portable skills. They do not require stable imperial glory, only need memory, and enough local resources to keep them alive. A gardener who once worked in a princely enclosure can apply the same logic in a humbler plot. A market grower can adopt practices that were once associated with elite spaces if they make the fruit better and the sale easier. Good methods are shameless that way. They will serve anyone who respects them. Historians still argue whether the decline of the Mughal center led to significant deterioration in the most sophisticated horticultural traditions, or whether those traditions actually diffused more widely as skilled workers moved into regional and commercial settings. It is a wonderfully slippery question. Grandeur may weaken in one place and expertise may deepen in another. A neglected imperial canal can coincide with a thriving suburban fruit belt. The visible symbols of empire may fade while the invisible habits of cultivation spread more freely than before. You can imagine former court gardeners carrying not only seeds and tools but habits of attention. The way one feels soil for hidden dampness. The instinct to shield a seedling from the western sun. The little trick of lifting fruit onto dry litter. The discipline of early watering. None of these things belong exclusively to palaces once they have entered muscle memory. They become part of regional craft. And craft, unlike architecture, travels lightly. There is also the matter of changing patronage. Regional rulers from Awadh to Hyderabad, from smaller princely states to wealthy zamindar households, continue versions of elite garden culture in different forms. Not every later garden is a perfect Mughal echo, of course. Styles mix. Local fashions shift. Colonial pressure later complicates matters further. Yet the broader love of ordered greenery, cooling water, seasonal fruit, and cultivated pleasure does not vanish. The names change. The budgets wobble. The melon still needs shade. A quirky tidbit from the history of old gardens is that practical spaces often outlast ceremonial intentions in the most stubborn ways. A terrace built for promenade may end up storing tools. A decorative channel may become a useful water line again. A once grand enclosure may turn partly productive because someone sensibly decides that if you already have walls, water access, and decent soil, you might as well grow something worth eating. Human beings are excellent at repurposing former splendor into practical comfort. It is one of our more dignified talents. You wander in your mind through a later version of these grounds. The plaster is a little worn. The paving less perfect. One fountain coughs rather than sings. But down near the beds there are still melon leaves spreading over shaped earth. A gardener still mutters at the weather. A boy still carries reeds for shade. Somewhere a householder still hopes to present cool fruit to a guest and look richer, calmer, and more in command of summer than he really feels. The old courtly ideal survives in miniature. Not always glorious, but recognizable. Then come new disruptions. Trade patterns shift. Colonial interests alter land revenue systems. Urban growth presses on older garden land. Some historic enclosures are reduced, subdivided, or neglected. New crops and new market habits emerge. Yet even then, fragments endure. Methods become local common sense. A technique once admired because it served a noble melon may now simply serve a decent one sold in town. History often works like this. What begins as prestige culture ends as inherited practicality. And of course, memory romanticizes selectively. Later generations may remember Mughal fruit and gardens as symbols of lost refinement, imagining an age when every melon was perfect and every watercourse sparkled and no one ever had an argument in the heat. This is nonsense, but soothing nonsense. Real gardens were always mixed things: beauty and labor, order and improvisation, fragrance and manure, poetry and sore backs. Their survival lies partly in the fact that they never depended on elegance alone. You start to feel a gentler rhythm in this long afterlife. The techniques remain because they answer recurring problems: how to cool roots, how to save moisture, how to protect fruit, how to make summer bearable by craft instead of wishful thinking. Those are not Mughal problems only. They are human problems in hot climates, repeated across generations. Which is why the story of these gardeners does not disappear when imperial banners fade. It settles into habit. It becomes less visible and more durable. As the imagined evening deepens over the older, slightly worn garden, there is something comforting in that continuity. The empire may loosen its grip. Buildings may age. Travelers may stop marveling in the same way. But under the vines, people still practice patience. They still rise before dawn. They still bargain with the season. They still hope that careful labor can turn heat into sweetness. And in that hope, the garden becomes timeless again. Not because nothing changes, but because the essential gestures remain recognizable. Water, earth, seed, shade, fruit, hand. A simple sequence, endlessly repeated under different rulers and different skies. By now the day is almost done, and your thoughts drift back where they began, toward the evening beds themselves, toward the hush after heat, toward the vines cooling under the first touch of night, where all these lessons gather quietly in the dust and the darkening leaves. By evening, the garden has changed its voice. The punishing glare is gone, the channels no longer flash like polished metal, and the melon leaves that looked strained at noon now seem to settle into themselves, broad and quiet over the cooling earth. You walk back along the same paths you crossed in the morning, but everything feels softer now, as if the whole place has exhaled after hours of holding its breath against the sun. Dust clings less aggressively. The air carries moisture where the channels run. Somewhere nearby a bird gives the sort of final, half-hearted call that sounds less like song and more like a clerk closing a ledger. It is a good hour for remembering. You have come full circle, back to the beds where the melons lie under their leaves like patient little moons. Only now they are no longer mysterious in the way they were at the beginning. You know too much for that. You know the dawn watering and the straying backs beside the wheels. You know the shaped mounds that hold coolness, the mulch that buys another hour of mercy, the seed packets guarded like family gossip, the reed screens tilted against the western blaze. You know the insects, the mildew, the rot, the household theories about digestion, the steward's pressure, the traveler's exaggeration, the regional rivalries, the long afterlife of useful techniques once the cord itself begins to fray. A melon now looks almost comically innocent considering the bureaucracy of care behind it. The mainstream historical fact that lingers most clearly in the dusk is perhaps the simplest one of all. Mughal gardens were never merely ornamental fantasies, but spaces where design, climate management, water engineering, status, and practical cultivation could meet in remarkably sophisticated ways. That truth feels more real now than when you first arrived among the channels. The grandeur of such places did not float free of labor. It was built from repeated, precise acts. A paradise garden was not an escape from maintenance. It was maintenance arranged beautifully enough to seem like paradise. You slow beside one bed and glance at the soil where the day's warmth still lives just under the surface. Above, the leaves move in the faintest breeze. Below, the roots hold whatever comfort the gardeners managed to store there before noon. That, perhaps, is the entire lesson distilled. Summer is not defeated here in one heroic gesture. It is softened through preparation. The melon is not conquered into sweetness. It is persuaded, over days and weeks, that the world is survivable enough to become delicious. Historians still argue whether the allure of Mughal garden culture has led later admirers to overemphasize visual form at the expense of seasonal, agricultural skill. It would not be surprising if it had. Human beings are easily hypnotized by fountains and symmetry. Soil moisture, by contrast, rarely gets a sonnet. Yet if you have followed the gardeners long enough, the real marvel begins to look less like marble channels and more like judgment. When to water, when to withhold, when to shade, when to expose, when to trust a variety, when to cut a fruit, when to admit that one vine is lost and save the others. The empire may love display, but the melon answers only to competence. A worker passes with an empty basket and nods to another near the far edge of the plot. Their voices are low. The day's urgency has drained into routine again. One checks a fruit tucked on its bed of dry litter, turning it slightly so one side does not sit too long in the same warmth. Another presses a finger into the soil, not because he doubts the morning's work, but because doubt is part of good gardening. Confidence grows melons badly. Attention grows them well. There is probably a lesson there for the rest of life, though it is irritating when produce becomes morally superior. A quirky tidbit drifts back to you from all the earlier layers of the story. Somewhere in this wider world, someone undoubtedly insisted that the best melons came only from one very specific district, and that all rivals were pretenders. The more you think about it, the more endearing it becomes. Of course, they argued about fruit geography. They had to. Once human beings discover something soothing, sweet, and seasonally scarce, they immediately begin forming factions around it. Civilizations have been quietly ridiculous for a very long time. Evening deepens. The water in the channels darkens from silver to ink. The brick edging gives back the day's last warmth in a low, steady breath. Somewhere beyond the garden proper, servants are finishing tasks, kitchens settling, household noises thinning into the calmer rhythms of night. The melon quarter remains almost secretive, its fruits hidden under leaves as if they are still deciding whether to trust tomorrow. You cannot really blame them. Tomorrow will be hot again. The gardeners know it. The vines know it. The whole system depends on accepting that summer returns every day and preparing anyway. And that preparation is what now feels most human about the place. Not the courtly symbolism, though that is real. Not the prestige of serving cool fruit to people with delicate opinions, though that too has its charm. What remains strongest is the rhythm of care, waking before sunrise, lifting water, reading soil, adjusting shade, noticing trouble early, and repeating the cycle without much applause. In a world that often celebrates the spectacular, the gardeners practice a quieter greatness. They save sweetness through routine. You stand one last time at the edge of the beds and think about the strange intimacy of what you have witnessed. The melons have carried empire, memory, medicine, status, and climate on their rinds, yet in the end they also belong to something simpler. They belong to hands. Hands choosing seeds. Hands crumbling earth. Hands tying reeds, clearing pests, carrying baskets, lifting slices, passing them across a room. The story has always been about hands pretending, successfully, that unbearable weather can be negotiated into pleasure. Now the first stars are faintly gathering above the garden walls, and the leaves no longer gleam so much as whisper. The day's edges blur. Paths soften. Shapes become gentler. The entire place seems to lower itself into rest, though of course the roots keep working in the dark, and somewhere the stored coolness remains tucked below the surface like a secret promise waiting for dawn. So you let the image settle. Melon vines spread low over shaped earth, channels murmuring in the dusk, warm brick fading under night air, and patient gardeners already held in the memory of tomorrow's tasks. The heat has not been defeated forever. It never is. But for one evening, through skill, repetition, and a frankly heroic amount of fussing, it has been answered. And now, as the last of the garden quiet gathers around you, the story softens too. You let your thoughts rest on the coolness hidden under the soil, on the broad leaves lying still in the dark, on the faint scent of water and earth that lingers after the day has spent itself. Nothing needs hurrying now. The vines can sleep in their beds of dust and shade, and the channels can whisper to themselves without being watched. The workers have gone, their footsteps folded back into the paths, their labor dissolved into the calm they made. Above, the sky opens wider and dimmer, and all the sharp edges of heat, rank, and effort drift outward, thinning into the warm night. You remember the hands that lifted water before sunrise, the fingers that tested soil, the quiet judgments that kept sweetness alive one small correction at a time. It all feels very far away now, softened by distance and darkness, as if the garden itself is covering the day with a gentle cloth. The melons lie under their leaves, round and silent, holding the last of the earth's cool breath. The reeds no longer click. The channels no longer glint. Even the air seems to move more slowly, as though it, too, has decided to be kind. So you remain here for a moment longer, beside the vines and the fading warmth of the path, while the garden settles fully into rest. And with it you let your own thoughts grow quiet, loose, and untroubled, until all that remains is the hush of water, the softness of leaves, and the feeling of night closing gently over everything at last.